Hi, I'm Rusty and welcome to Rusty's Area 51. Today we're going to be doing a clutch replacement on Mike's Nissan 2006 Frontier truck. We're going to start by working on the truck on the ground. We're going to be disconnecting the battery, taking out the console, removing the shifter, and while we're under the hood of the truck, we're going to be checking a few things like whether the fan is going to clear the fan shroud, whether the engine will clear the firewall, and what type of fluid is going to be needed to replace the slave cylinder in the hydraulic clutch. In the old days, in your V8 Chevrolets, if you dropped the crossmember out and lowered the transmission, you would crack the distributor cap when the engine rolled back. So we have here today the clutch kit for the replacement. Here's the pressure plate, the throwout bearing, the disc, the pilot bearing, and the clutch alignment tool, which goes through the disc and into the pilot bearing. Now, I have turned a little driver to drive the new pilot bushing into the end of the crankshaft. You don't want to be hitting this pilot bushing with a hammer and scarring it, for the last thing you want is to have problems putting your transmission into the new pilot bushing if you're laying underneath the car and can't get that transmission into the pilot bearing. We're going to be, once we get the shifter and the battery disconnected, we'll be setting the lift underneath the truck, raising the truck, and we'll proceed with the procedure of removing the drive shaft, removing the starter, taking the hydraulic hose out of the slave cylinder for the clutch, using these tools to remove the hose. I have miscellaneous caps here to cap the end of that hydraulic hose so it won't be draining fluid all over us. We may have to deal with the emergency brake cable. This is a 4-cylinder truck. Hopefully we won't have to deal with the exhaust system. If so, to get the crossmember out, we may have to drop the exhaust system. Once the starter, drive shaft, and stuff out, we'll set the transmission jack underneath the transmission, put a little tension on it, proceed to remove the crossmember. Probably this transmission has the bell housing on the transmission. Once we get the crossmember out, we'll remove the bell housing bolts, slip the transmission out, and remove the bolts from the pressure plate. Now we want to make sure to have control of the pressure plate and the discs so they don't fall on our feet. I am wearing my steel-toed boots. We want to make sure that we take care of our safety here. Then we'll remove the flywheel bolts, take the flywheel off. We'll take the flywheel down to the machine shop, get it resurfaced. In the time we come back, we'll need to press the old throwout bearing off the slave cylinder, replace it, get the pilot bushing out of the back of the crankshaft. This can be a trick. Either you can use a hook tool to get this out, or fill the pilot bushing with grease and drive a tool into it hydraulically, forcing it out of the crankshaft. And once it's out, you'll need to get the grease out of the crankshaft and drive your new bushing in. Get the flywheel back from the machine shop, put it back on the crankshaft, torque it to spec. When you put your pressure plate back on, there will be alignment pins. There is a side of this that says flywheel side on the clutch disc. Make sure you don't get your disc in backwards. Put your tool through to the pilot bearing, get this aligned. Put your pressure plate on the alignment pins on the flywheel. Put some bolts in, tighten cross bolts up to the flywheel, just a little tension, get all bolts snug, just a little tension, then continue to work your pressure plate bolts a quarter to a third of a turn equally all the way around so that you don't warp your pressure plate. This is very, very important. Once all the pressure plate bolts are up to the flywheel, then torque them to spec. These are probably 8mm bolts. My guess the spec to that would be about 18 foot-pounds, but look that up in your manual. Then pull your pilot tool out. Make sure that it slips in and out easily so that there's no tension on this. One thing I forgot to mention is make sure that your clutch disc does fit your transmission shaft, that your pilot bushing does fit your transmission shaft, that you did get the right parts for your transmission. One thing, while your transmission is out, you might take a little wire toothbrush and clean all the splines on your transmission and make sure that there's no dirt, debris on your transmission shaft, and that this does slide easily over your transmission shaft. Once you get this, slide your transmission in, making sure that the transmission and bell housing or engine are parallel. If they're not parallel, you will not slide the transmission shaft into your clutch easily. If they make sure that they are parallel and slide in easily. You can start a couple of bolts, but do not use the bolt to tighten the transmission into the engine. They should slide together easily. Once they're together and bolted up, your bell housing bolts are torqued properly, then go ahead and raise the transmission, get your transmission mount, and inspect your transmission mount and make sure that it is good and not oil deteriorated. Get your transmission mount, your cross member bolts in, and you can go ahead and assemble your drive shaft, your emergency brake cable, your starter, and be careful not to twist off your electrical cable into your starter, and go ahead and reassemble and you should be good. Okay, so let's get to the project.